The first thing Staff Sergeant Harlow noticed when she stepped onto the tarmac at CFB Petawawa was that nobody came to meet her. That wasn't unusual. She'd arrived at a dozen forward operating bases in her career, and the welcome had always been the same. A clipboard, a bunk assignment, and someone pointing at a map without making eye contact. What was unusual was the laughter. It came from the far end of the hangar, low and unhurried, the kind that meant the joke had been told before her boots hit the ground. She didn't look, she'd learned not to. Her kit bag weighed 38 kilograms. She'd packed it herself the night before in her apartment in Edmonton, folding her gear the way her father had taught her. Tight at the corners, nothing wasted. He'd been a long-range shooter with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Bosnia. He'd never talked much about any of it. What he had taught her, in the flat open country behind their house in Lacombe, Alberta, was how to be still, how to make the wind irrelevant, how to breathe in a way that turned the body into a platform rather than a problem. She'd been 14, the first time she outshot him at 1,000 meters. He hadn't said anything. He just nodded once and started packing up the targets. That nod had cost her 10 years to understand. The Petawawa tasking was supposed to be routine, a joint training exercise, 2 weeks, mixed units from across the forces. Harlow had been assigned as the designated marksman for a reconnaissance element, a role she'd held through 3 rotations and hadn't lost yet. The task force commander was a major named Gilles Fournier, out of Valcartier, who had the kind of stillness in his face that came either from competence or from not paying attention. Harlow hadn't worked out which yet. The reconnaissance element had 4 other members. Sergeant Duff was the team lead on the ground, a broad man from Cape Breton who moved slowly and thought quickly and had the specific social warmth of someone who'd spent too many years in small rooms with the same people. He shook her hand. When she arrived at the briefing room, said "Harlow," and moved on. She appreciated that. Corporal C was the signaller, young, meticulous, barely looked up from his equipment board when she walked in. Private Whitmore and Private Legault were the riflemen. Whitmore was from somewhere in rural Manitoba. She could tell by the way he held his coffee mug, both hands, like the heat might be taken from him. Legault was from Trois-Rivières, compact and quiet, with the slight forward lean of someone who was always calculating the nearest exit. And then there was Connolly. Master Corporal Connolly was not from anywhere she could identify, which usually meant he'd moved so often that the geography had stopped sticking. He was sitting at the back of the briefing room when she entered, arms crossed, already looking at her with the specific expression she had cataloged carefully over the years. Not hostile, not aggressive, but evaluative in the way that preceded dismissal. He was assessing how much of her presence was real and how much was documentation. "Harlow," Duff said from the front of the room, "takes the long glass." Connolly said nothing. He looked at the ceiling. That was how it started. She didn't take it personally. Or rather, she had learned to put it somewhere specific in her mind, a shelf in a room she didn't visit often. The skepticism was structural. It came from a particular arithmetic that went, women were newer to the role, therefore this woman was newer to the role, therefore the specific data point standing in front of him with 38 kilograms of kit and 10 years of confirmed marksmanship records was suspect until proven otherwise. The arithmetic was wrong. It had always been wrong. But it was not uniquely his error, and she had long since stopped expecting the error to correct itself in advance of the evidence. What she had not yet worked out was why, in this case, the arithmetic bothered her more than it usually did. The training scenario was a 4-day exercise in the Petawawa training area, dense mixed boreal to the north, open rocky ground to the east, a constructed mock installation about 12 kilometers from the staging area. The mission objective was to surveil the installation, identify simulated threat assets, and report without detection. It was the kind of exercise she'd done in varying forms since her 3rd year in uniform. She was not nervous about the exercise. She was in some quieter part of herself, nervous about something she hadn't named yet. The first day went without event. She moved with the element, read the ground, noted the wind shift at the tree line, kept her observations to herself, because Connolly had a habit of completing other people's sentences in briefings, and she didn't want her assessments laundered through his voice before they reached Duff. It was a small thing, but small things in confined tactical environments tended to calcify. That evening, in the lean-to shelter, Connolly said to Whitmore, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the careful volume of someone who had decided to be overheard, 300 meters, clean sight lines, and we've got a designated marksman. What exactly are we protecting here? Whitmore didn't answer. Legault was studying his map. Harlow was cleaning her rifle. She finished the action she was on before she said anything. The installation has elevated ground on the northwest approach, she said. Sight lines from that ridge cover the south entrance and 2 of the 3 vehicle access points. If we're assessing threat assets, that's where I need to be. Not at 300 meters. Connolly looked at her. That's 800 meters minimum, yes. He held the look for another second. Then he looked back at Whitmore. She didn't say anything else. She reassembled her rifle and wrote up her observation notes in the small field notebook she kept in her left breast pocket. The one her father had given her the year before he died, its cover worn smooth in the way of objects that had been handled in cold weather for a long time. He died 2 years ago, in the spring. A cardiac event, the doctors called it, which was the kind of language that tried to make sudden things sound orderly. He'd been out in the field behind the house in Lacombe, checking the spotting scope he'd set up before winter, and he'd simply not come back in. She'd been in Shiloh when it happened, on a range qualification. She'd found out by phone. The thing about grief, Harlow had discovered, was that it did not interrupt the work. It moved alongside it. On the morning of his funeral, she'd driven from Edmonton to Lacombe in her uniform, stood at the graveside in the February cold, gone back to Edmonton, and been on a range at 0600 the next morning. Not because she was suppressing anything, because the range was where she knew how to be most herself, and that, for the moment, had been enough. She hadn't told anyone at Petawawa about her father. She didn't discuss personal context with people she'd known for less than 48 hours. But she had, without entirely meaning to, tucked his field notebook into her kit bag, and that felt like a form of disclosure that required no audience. The second day, the weather changed. A low-pressure system had been sitting over the Ottawa Valley for 36 hours, and it moved northwest overnight, bringing a cold front that dropped the temperature 12 degrees and pushed a variable crosswind across the training area that made the eastern ridge, which had looked clean and manageable on the map, considerably more complicated in practice. She read it from the tree line movement, from the dry grass in the open ground, from the cold settling differently in the low spots than on the heights. She told Duff she wanted to reposition. He asked her why. She explained the wind variable, the adjusted hold required at the new effective range, the sightline advantage that still held even accounting for the changed conditions. Duff listened. He nodded. He said, "Your call." Connolly, standing 2 meters behind them, said nothing. She repositioned 200 meters north along the ridgeline, found a shelf of exposed limestone that offered both a stable firing position and a depression deep enough to break her silhouette. She settled in. She adjusted her dope for temperature and pressure. 7 degrees Celsius, barometric at 100.4 kilopascals, crosswind, reading approximately 11 kilometers per hour from the northwest with gusts to 18. She noted the gusts. The gusts were the problem. You could compensate for consistent wind. It became a known quantity, something you built into the calculation and left. Variable wind was different. Variable wind required patience of a specific kind. Not the patience of waiting, but the patience of reading, of watching the grass, the treetops, the subtle movement of air across the rock face below her position, until a pattern emerged that you could trust for the 2-second window between the gust and the lull. Her father had called it listening with your eyes. She lay there for 4 hours. In that time, she logged 11 separate observations. 2 vehicle passes on the south access route, a 3-person patrol moving along the mock installation's western perimeter at irregular intervals, 1 static asset she identified as a simulated command tent positioned just inside the tree line at the northern edge, barely visible, partially obscured by a spruce windbreak, the kind of position that would have been invisible to anyone not lying at elevation with a scope and 4 hours of stillness in their body. She radioed T with each observation. T logged them. Duff received the logs. When she came off the ridge at last light, Connolly was at the staging area. He didn't say anything until she'd set her rifle down, and then he said, "You called the tent?" "Yes. I didn't see it from the south approach. It's not visible from the south approach." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't fully recognize. Not concession, not admiration. Something more neutral than either, the look of someone updating a calculation they thought had been finished. "Good call on the repositioning," he said. She said, "The wind data was there." He nodded. He walked away. It was not an apology. She hadn't been looking for one. On the morning of the third day, Duff received a modified scenario from the exercise control element. The brief was short. A simulated hostile element had been introduced to the training area, operating from a secondary position east of the main installation. The element was mobile. The exercise objective was now to identify the mobile element's pattern of movement and provide targeting data for a simulated interdiction. The difference between this scenario and the previous day's work was not tactical, it was psychological. The previous day she'd been logging static intelligence. Observation, record, transmit. That was methodical. That was the part of the work that looked, from the outside, like patience. What the new scenario required was something harder to explain to someone who hadn't done it. She had to get inside the rhythm of another person's movement. She had to read not just what they were doing, but how they thought about what they were doing. Their habits, their assumptions about where they were safe, the places they slowed down, and the places they didn't, the unconscious logic of how someone moved through terrain when they believed they were unobserved. This was what long-range work actually was, under the technical language, and the ballistic tables, and the cold, and the waiting. It was about understanding a person well enough to find them in the moment they stopped understanding themselves. She found a new position, tighter, further east, more exposed, but necessary. The wind had settled overnight into a consistent 8 kilometers per hour from the northwest, which was manageable. The temperature was up 2 degrees. She settled in at 0630. At 0843, she identified the simulated mobile element, 2 personnel, moving in a loose loop around the eastern perimeter of the installation, using a dried creek bed as a movement corridor. She watched them make the circuit twice before she had their timing. The third circuit, she had their pattern. By the fourth, she understood that they had a habit of pausing at a particular rock outcrop on the northeastern corner. Just briefly, 5 or 6 seconds, probably checking their position against a map reference. And that this pause was consistent. She radioed Sick. She gave him the grid, the timing, the pause point. Duff came on the net. Confirm you have the target solution. Confirmed. Consistent pause at grid 114, 7 seconds on a 9-minute cycle. There was a pause on the net, then Connolly's voice. That's a tight window. Harlow said. I know. She waited. The mobile element made its 5th circuit. She tracked them through the creek bed, through the open ground, up to the rock outcrop at grid 114. They paused. She had already made every calculation that needed making. The wind was reading at 7.3 kilometers per hour in this moment. She could see it in the dry grass 40 meters to her right. Temperature, pressure, distance, angle, all of it was already resolved, already built into the position of the crosshair. She called the simulated shot. The exercise controller confirmed. Target element neutralized, timing within assessment parameters. She made the radio call flat and even, the same way she'd have made any other call. On the net for a moment, nothing. Then Duff said, "Good shooting, Harlow." Connolly said nothing. But when she came down from the position an hour later, she found him at the range log, entering her data himself, without being asked, which was not his job. He didn't look up when she approached. He finished what he was writing, capped the pen, and handed her the log. She took it. She didn't say anything. There was a version of this moment she knew that wanted to be significant, a scene in which something shifted, something was acknowledged, in which the record was set straight in some visible and satisfying way. The kind of resolution that felt proportionate to the effort it had taken to get there. That wasn't what happened. What happened was that Duff called a debrief for 1700, and they sat around the folding table in the briefing room, and she walked through her observation logs with the same dry precision she used for every debrief, and Connolly sat 2 seats to her left and said very little, and TSE confirmed the radio logs, and Legault asked a good question about the creek bed corridor that she answered directly, and Whitmore drank his coffee from both hands, and Fournier, who had appeared for the first time since the exercise began, listened with his still face, and at the end said, "Good work, all of you." She wrote up her range notes that evening. She sat outside the shelter with the notebook on her knee and the cold coming down through the trees, a particular kind of October cold that settled without drama, just settled, the way cold does in Ontario when the season has made up its mind. She thought about her father. Not with sadness, exactly. With the specific quality of attention she gave to things she wanted to remember clearly. He had never told her that she was good enough. He had never needed to. What he had given her instead was the habit of the work itself. The ritual of preparation, the careful reading of conditions, the long, patient practice of making herself accurate in circumstances that didn't cooperate. He had given her a way of being in the world that didn't require anyone's confirmation to function. She understood now, sitting in the October cold with the notebook on her knee, what the nod had meant. He hadn't been confirming her score. He'd been showing her that the score confirmed itself. The fourth day was administrative, equipment check, after-action documentation, transport back to the staging area. Connolly fell in beside her on the walk back through the tree line, which was not something she'd expected. He matched her pace without adjusting his stride, which told her it was deliberate. He said, "The ridge call on day 2. What made you confident on the wind, Red?" She thought about it, not because the answer was complicated, but because she wanted to give him the real answer rather than a compact version of it. "My father used to call it layered reading," she said. "You don't look at one indicator. You look at the grass, the tree line, the movement in the low ground versus the high ground, the way the cold settles in the depressions. Each one gives you a piece. You put the pieces together and you get something closer to a full picture." Connolly walked for a moment without speaking. "He teach you to shoot, mostly. He's still shooting?" "He died 2 years ago." Connolly said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry," she said. "He knew I could do it." That was enough. They came out of the tree line onto the open ground near the staging area. The light was flat and gray, the kind that happened when the cloud cover was even, no shadows, everything visible at its own depth without help from the sun. It was, she had always thought, the best light for seeing clearly. Not the most dramatic, just the most accurate. The vehicles were staged and waiting. Duff was at the hood of the lead truck with the convoy manifest, ticking names with a pen. He looked up when they came out of the trees. "Harlow," he said. "Good exercise," she said. "Thank you, Sergeant." She put her kit bag in the truck and climbed in after it and looked out the window at the training area. The ridge to the north, the rock shelf she'd lain on for 4 hours with the wind reading in her eyes. The eastern perimeter where the creek bed ran between the trees. It looked, from here, like just ground. It looked ordinary. She knew it was not ordinary. She knew what it had taken. She knew the calculations and the patience and the grief that had moved alongside all of it, quiet and present and entirely her own. The truck started. The convoy moved. She opened her father's notebook and made the last entry for the exercise. Date, location, conditions, observations. Then she closed it and held it in both hands and watched the tree line pass and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said in the work. That was the only language that had ever been qualified to speak for her.